We have two brilliant experts to talk about it. Maybe you know, yesterday Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov gave an interview to Российская Газета where he again blames the United States for current crisis in US-Russia relations. And basically he was saying that Russia is interested in improving relations, but will not initiate any discussions on that. If you want to talk about sanctions, if you want to talk about Ukraine, if you talk about anything, United States, according to Lavrov, should start the discussion with Russia. He also blamed Washington for being very pushy with Europeans. According to him, Europe has a very different approach to Russia, but under pressure from Washington, Europe has tight hands and can do nothing yet to get out from this American strategy toward Russia. What is American strategy toward Russia? Strategy, not tactical approach. This is the topic of our report. And we just had a couple of words with each other, and we realized that you guys know not less than we do about this topic. So I hope it will be a discussion, not just a presentation. And it's easy to criticize us, and we're ready for any positive responses. But we're more interested in a critical approach because it's really a topic for discussion. I feel personally there's a very deep intellectual dead end what to do in US-Russia relations. We don't know how to approach it, and it seems like we're going from crisis to crisis, and we can't get any kind of new agenda, or whatever you want to call it. Maybe it's Putin's fault, maybe it's somebody else's fault, but let's talk about this. Why for 25 years we cannot shape a new US-Russia agenda, and what to do, not just because of Ukraine, but in a strategic term. Are we capable to work together and be friendly, or we are always will be kind of countries looking on each other with a suspicious and holding a knife behind the back? So let's start the discussion. I hope that this discussion is very well needed in Washington, a discussion very well needed in Moscow. Unfortunately, all discussions so far I watched, they very much concentrated on a very daily issues, day-to-day issues. Let's try to look on this a little bit more strategic, and that was our approach. Everybody knows our experts, and I'm very happy that we convinced them to work with us. They both are in a very top of group of world experts on US-Russia relations and foreign policy. Richard Weitz, who is a primary writer of this report, is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at Hudson Institute. I hope you have his bio. I don't have to waste your time and steal time from them to introduce them more and more in details, because you know them for years. And Fiona Hill, who is now director of the Center of the United States and Europe and a senior fellow in the foreign, so long your titles, senior fellow in the foreign policy programs at the Brookings Institution. So everybody knows her as well for years and years. We're very close friends, and as you know, her latest book is about Putin. It just came out in the second edition with Cliff Gatti. So it was translated in Russia, right?
Not yet.
I don't think it's will.
I'm sure it's officially out.
So we have really top experts, and we really ask them to think strategically, and always at the Center of Global Interest we have approach to come up with some sort of recommendations for major players in this game. Not just to do analysis, not just to talk about history, to blame, to explain something, but to come up with a set of recommendations. And I would really ask you to pay attention to recommendations to help us to sharpen them. Richard managed to take this report to Russia recently and to introduce it to Russians, and he's still, you see, alive and well. He just came back from Moscow, and he introduced it to international discussion Valdai Club, and got a very positive, I mean, a relatively positive response. Then he introduced it to Carnegie in Moscow and some other organizations. And this is the first time, basically, we present this report in the United States. So your reaction and your questions, your protests, or whatever you have to say, is extremely important for us. So thank you again for coming, and I'm turning the mic to Richard, please. We'll have a very simple format, like 10, 12 minutes each of them will talk, and then let's open for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thank you all for coming. It's a good sign that people are still interested in Russia and U.S. relations. So many of you are here, despite the wonderful weather outside. I appreciate that. It's been a great pleasure working with CGI and others on developing the project. Great. Can you hear me? All right. All right. And is that better?
Yes.
All right. And I mean, they were great in terms of allowing me full intellectual freedom, and they let me basically argue with them. We changed some of the hypotheses and so on. I think it worked out really well. I think the fact that you're here makes me clear that you agree with me that this relationship is still incredibly important for many of the issues that concern us. I mean, Russia and the United States, it's hard to see how they can realize many of their short-terms and certainly their long-term goals unless there's some at least tacit or non-confrontational approaches to many of these issues. They both have the world's most powerful militaries, and if you consider their nuclear forces, they have wide-ranging alliance networks, especially the U.S. There are certain asymmetries which make it a little the relationship more complicated, but do allow for trade-offs. I mean, Russia is becoming increasingly the dominant player in Eurasia, whereas at the same time its influence outside of that region is steadily eroded, and despite efforts to expand in the Middle East, for example, or East Asia. Russia is certainly a great military power. It's less of an economic power. There are some areas, pockets of strength, particularly in the energy dimension. And certain great scientists and great potential, but in many areas they have yet to fully apply that, move from the blackboard to the production line. Whereas the U.S., the economy is much more complicated. Still the world's leading economic power in many respects, but eroding in some domains. In geography, Russia is precisely located in regions of great interest to the world, the future of the world, right in the middle, close by to Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Gives it some inherent advantage and influence. It, of course, has UN Security Council veto and so on. However, the relationship has been complicated not only by these similarities and differences, but mainly because of it's really hard to define a relationship when you're not an ally or friendly country, but you're not open adversaries either. This is very tricky. We're trying to manage this in the case of China. We may have to confront that issue in the case of Iran soon. It's certainly very difficult because you can find it hard to mentalize and cooperate where you can and disagree where you must. I know Mr. Lavrov explicitly said that won't longer work, although the U.S. will still sort of profess support for that idea. But it's going to be difficult to manage, and there's no easy long-term answers. You'll see for those of you who can read through the whole report. However, there are certain areas, I think, where the cooperation will be sustained, or at least it will avoid confrontation just because the mutual interests are strong. And both governments have shown they can reach pragmatic deals. They're not ideologically driven leaders, I would say. Even in the case of Russia, I think that Putin has shown he can reach pragmatic deals when necessary, and he did that in the case earlier, for example, of U.S. missile defenses and when he was with the ABM treaty. So it's possible to return to that when the situation changes, and of course there'll be new leaders in both countries soon, although less soon in the case of Russia than the US probably. The main reasons for the recent deterioration in relations, I think, are well known to all of us. I don't need to go into those. They range from different perceptions of how to react to various regional events, concerns about domestic developments within Russia, and their impact on the country's foreign policy. Difficulties the U.S. has had in general sustaining coherent policies towards important regions of the world. I mean, it's unlikely to see a rebound soon from the recent troubles. I mean, I think they're just inherent long-term sources of structural problems in the relationship. For example, there are visions of how the world should be run, starting the most basic, is fundamentally different. I mean, the Russians have generally a complaint that they are not treated as equal by the United States, and they should be. Whereas I think the United States, at least the current administration, does not consider Russia a vitally important power for many of the issues that concern it, and so it often feels safe ignoring Russia, which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. We have differences over regional perceptions. Ukraine's the most obvious. I mean, even if we're going to get a truce, I still think that there's just different visions of where you want to go with that relationship. More broadly, European security, the Russians are never going to be comfortable with having a NATO as the primary security institution in that region, and yet the allies led by the United States are not willing to change that through a European security treaty or something now, or some other mechanism that would supersede NATO and create some kind of new structure. In terms of Asia, that's still very much in play because of China. And so far, it's been interesting. We haven't seen the kind of 2 against 1 balancing we saw during the Cold War. And the Chinese and the Russians are getting closer together, but there's still, on the side, at least of the Chinese, reluctance to join an open alliance against the United States, and that cooperation and relation remains constrained and troubled. And I know there's a CGI report coming out on that very question, as well as observe comments to that one. In terms of the economic and social sphere, that's always been a weakness. I mean, the ties are small. The number of people who are interested in studying Russia and the United States continues to decline. The economic relationship has always been troubled by some fundamental issues such as we don't need Russian oil and gas, and trade and restrictions on technology transfer, and difficulties doing business in Russia for Western companies and so on. And that doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon. The human rights issue is something that even if it wanted to, no U.S. administration could ignore, and so they're invariably going to criticize developments that happen within Russia. And the Russians will sometimes take an abrasion by the fact that the United States thinks that Russia should be a Western democracy like a typical European country. And so when it applies those standards, and for example, treats Russia more harshly on this issue than China, the Russians don't like it, even though it's really just because I think Americans have to think that Russia should be at a higher level of development. Actually, it's just, we just have very high standards to where the kind of political system and we'd like to see in Russia. In terms of arms control, the area I focused on most in my past, and would have perhaps in this paper, if I had free reign, would be, I just don't see any great opportunities coming in the next few years, just because there's some fundamental differences. The United States, the current administration wants to maybe make another cut of the 2 nuclear forces held by both sides, and perhaps deal with some issues that have been excluded, tactical nuclear weapons, and so on. Whereas the Russians insist we need to start thinking about other countries. They don't say China, but they certainly do say Britain and France. We need to, their view, address some of the issues that are related but not particularly nuclear, which is missile defenses or precision strike weapons, or now these new systems that are developing. And as the technology continues to evolve, as we get into hypersonic systems, it's going to be even more complicated. That said, there's not a fundamental reason why we're going to see direct confrontation between the two beyond what we're seeing now. I mean, I think that the willingness of the U.S. to confront Russia in Eurasia is limited. We're seeing that in Ukraine now. We saw that early in Germany. The Russian either ability or aspirations to try and kind of take on NATO directly, trying to seize the Baltic, for example, it's not evident at the moment. I think for good reason. So, elsewhere, so far, they're managed to integrate in Asia pretty much aside from each other. The Middle East, I mean, that's the big, people often say, well, we're in another Cold War, aren't we? I just look at what's happening in Syria. I mean, as you remember, whenever there was a Middle East crisis during the Cold War, the first thing we'd wonder is, are the Russian forces going to intervene? Are they on nuclear alert? How are we going to respond? We don't see any of that in the case of Syria, and I don't think we'll see that in Iraq or anything. The Russians just don't have the capacity or aspirations to play that. And ideally, we'll continue to sustain some kind of cooperation over Iran, Korea. Thus far, looking at people involved in those have said that the relationship has not suffered, at least on the working level. The Russians have cooperated fairly well in the case of Iran and Korea negotiations. And it's unfortunate the Russians are now not coming to the nuclear security summit, but they haven't tried to get other countries not to come, so we may go containing this. But going forward, it's going to take, I think, some fundamental changes. I think we're going to need some more greater reason to cooperate economically. We'll probably need to see a different government in Russia just because of the way, I mean, I just think it's the general feelings about Putin in the U.S. political elite are such that I think this can be difficult to develop a close relationship with his government, where successor may not be so constrained. But Fiona's actually dealt with this man directly, so I'm very interested in hearing her comments in the general paper and in the
Well, I can't say I've dealt with him directly. I've been as close to him as I have to you, and Collier's been closer. So if we can look at him, you've been directly addressed by Putin in certain environments there, Collier. But I have spent a lot of time reading pretty much everything that Putin has been saying, which I can tell you leads to some, kind of weird mental strain after a period of time when you're trying to read everything that somebody is saying or kind of watch them constantly on YouTube. Even my 8-year-old daughter's become obsessed with Mr. Putin because while she's watching, some kind of kiddie program, on her iPad, I'm watching the latest President or the latest video about Crimea, and she's always saying, "What are you watching?" And it leads to all kinds of strange 8-year-old level explanations of what I'm up to. In any case, that has, however, when you have to explain something at a very limited level, given me a few insights into some of the issues that are troubling us the most. And I think there's one element in Richard's really very thorough and excellent report here that perhaps merits a little bit of further development. It's that line that you basically emphasised, Richard, that the US looks at Russia as a more advanced and higher level country than many of the other players in which it interacts with. Now, of course, Russia also looks around the world and sees Turkey and Iran as these sort of ancient empires, and China in the same frame as countries that it's dealt with for a long time over the millennia. But I think one of the biggest problems we've had over this last 25 years is failing to see that Russia is actually in a very different place from where the United States has always thought that it should be. Partly that's because of the rhetoric that's come out of Moscow as well from the very beginning, and Gorbachev, when he started to think about the closer relationships and the discussions about a common European home, was picked up by Yeltsin, and also by statements that Putin himself has made about Russians being Europeans. I mean, in the United States, that's been taken as implying that the way that Russia thinks about the world is pretty much the same as other European allies, even though, of course, there's a lot of difference between the way that our various European allies think about the world as well. And Piotr Raven and a number of other Russian figures have repeated something that they've heard many others say. Putin himself has hinted at it, that when the United States look at Russians, they pretty much see people like themselves. But when they look at China, Chinese or Iranians, they actually see people with a different frame of reference. And that was the message that Angela Merkel was trying to get over to Putin, to Obama after her many conversations with Vladimir Putin about the crisis in Ukraine, when she said he lives in another world, what she meant was he has a very different frame of reference, and that those around him do, and that she, having grown up in East Germany, at least had some general sense of that. And I think that that's fundamentally one of our problems that's dogged the last 25 years that you've said, where we can't quite get past the lack of trust, because we clearly have very different bases in which we interpret things, and we have very different perceptions and very different narratives about the last 25 years, but not just about the last 25 years, but about the entirety of history in the past. And Putin is somebody who thinks a lot about history. He's kind of like the classic amateur history buff who's read all kinds of things, mostly about Russian history, hasn't taken a college history course, which of course, many of us might think, well, so what? But then hasn't really kind of then approached history as more than a source of lots of information. He doesn't think about the way that history gets told and retold, and the fact that others have different narratives. And one of the other issues that I just want to highlight before we go into the discussion is that the misperception that we have when, from the United States perspective, when we look at Russia and think that Russians should think in the same way as, say, Germans or even Poles or Brits or French, is that when Russians look at us and the United States, they also have a certain set of frames and interpretations that they bring to this, and also to other Europeans. And one of the most telling points of this is where Collier started off in talking about Lavrov's blame on the United States for putting pressure on Europe, for actually having a very different perspective. Now, as I'm the director of the Centre on the United States and Europe, I actually spent a lot of time talking to Europeans. And in spite of my accent and the fact that Britain might soon come out of the EU, I actually do think of myself somewhat as a European. And I've spent a lot of time in the last several months since the crisis in Ukraine talking to a whole range of European experts and some officials about their perceptions and their understanding of their relations with Russia right now and what they think about Ukraine. And I can tell you that a lot of Europeans are actually much more hawkish than they are presented in the newspapers here, and a lot more hawkish than Russia and the Kremlin might think that they are. And one of the major perceptional problems actually comes down to Germany. Putin, in particular, thinks that he understands Germany very well. He speaks excellent German. This is a fact. He really does speak excellent German. He spent the 1980s, a big part of the 1980s, in Dresden, in East Germany. And he spent an awful lot of time courting prominent Germans, most famously Gerhard Schröder. The two of them bonded over World War II and their respective narratives of this. He hasn't done so well with Angela Merkel and many others. But recently he's completely lost a lot of the German elite, including many in the business elite. And part of this is because of his narrative about World War II. And this is, again, I just want to use this as an illustration of the problems that we have, because it might help us in thinking ahead when we look at the very solid recommendations about a different way that we might bring a frame or a new frame to the relationship, to try to understanding why we're actually off on different trajectories, why there's so much mistrust, which is really at the root of the problems that we have. You've probably noticed that Putin has been talking a lot about the MolotovRibbentrop Pact recently, which has not gone down well here in the United States, but has also not gone down very well in Germany at all. Putin's been trying to tell Germans that their narrative of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was basically imposed upon them by the US occupying force after World War II. That's actually not the case. The documentation for the secret protocol and all the materials of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact has been out there in West Germany and Europe for some time. I personally, when I was a graduate student in history back at Harvard in the 1990s, when the Soviet government opened up the files and that as well, also looked at all of this material. But the narrative that Putin is spinning is not necessarily just dissembling and kind of manipulation of the facts, as one might think from a KGB agent. It actually comes from Putin's own reading of the history of the Molotov Pact that comes partly out of Soviet historiography, which was, of course, very much tailored to a revision in many respects to the narrative of World War II. Nobody wanted to admit that the Soviet Union had been kind of caught out by a complete strategic misreading of Germany. And of course, we all remember the story of Stalin, ostensibly lying on his couch in a deep funk for days, because he couldn't believe that he'd completely miscalculated on the non-aggression pact, and that the Nazi forces had actually invaded the Soviet Union. But also, it comes out of Putin's own experience in East Germany, where there wasn't really a great deal of soul searching about World War II. East Germans very quickly became communists. The blame for the crimes and atrocities of the Nazi regime and for fascism was put on the capitalist West. If you look at all of the Soviet propaganda from the 1950s, you can see this very clearly. I have a poster that actually I was thinking about bringing with me from 1952 that mushes together the same kind of propaganda we get about the capitalist, fascist West, driven by the United States. There's a kind of a picture of a Hitler character driving Uncle Sam, both of them look very Jewish, by the way, in an atom bomb car with a big A on the front, carrying syringes of the plague, smallpox and typhus, off under the banner of world governance, down towards the abyss. And it says, you know, along Hitler's path there is only one end, you know, off the edge. And this is the kind of imagery that we're getting, you know, back up again in Russian propaganda right straight out of the 1950s. In fact, 1952 is the year that Putin was born, so he would have seen some of these propaganda posters, no doubt, in his childhood. But the message of this, you know, whole revisionism of what really happened during the war, this was the history, the narrative that was very common in East Germany. And I've interviewed quite a lot of people who from the East in Germany about some of the impressions that they had about World War II. They were clear that the war had happened, but in many cases, of course, and they were clear that Germany was on the wrong side of everything. But many of the victims of the war were depicted as communists. And East Germans were also depicted as having suffered in that context as well. And Putin spends a lot of time separating off fascism and the evils of capitalism from Germany and Germans and reconciliation. And so he's actually quite sincere when he starts to tell his narrative about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. There are also quite some strange sincerity in the Lavrov belief that the Europeans are being pressured. It's still this kind of occupation mentality for after World War II into thinking in a different way. And they're actually looking beyond the fact that for many Europeans, the Germans in particular, they're not very happy with this narrative that's coming out of Russia either. And they've also formed their own views of what's happened in Ukraine. In fact, the taboo that is being crossed is not a taboo that the United States has naturally set down in terms of the forceful annexation of territory within Europe. This is a taboo for European countries. And when the Germans hear about the annexation of historical territory, and Russia has Königsberg, the home of Immanuel Kant, East Prussia, that was never until the end of World War II, under the territory of any other country. You know, obviously you can think what's going on through the minds of many in the German elite who are obviously making no claims whatsoever to that territory, or seeking in any way to overturn the territorial juxtaposition that happened at the end of World War II. So there's actually quite a bit of a difference here, and the United States actually understands that. That the Europeans and many Europeans are in a different place. So the narrative that the United States is all to blame for this is also something that from the Russian side ought to be inspected more clearly. So the point that I wanted to say is, because Richard has really laid out, I think, an extraordinarily good set of issues, is that we need to have different frames of how we look at the relationship. We have to understand that there are different narratives, there are different perspectives, and these come out of really very different histories and different understandings of what's happened either during World War II, since World War II, during the Cold War, and then very much so since 1989. I think you illustrated very well in the report, obviously, you know, the difference in perceptions of what the end of the Cold War meant too. And we've heard, you know, most recently, you know, many Russians saying that, look, we weren't forced, you know, basically to try to join the Western institutions at the end of the Cold War. We voluntarily, you know, sought entry, which is, you know, was certainly the depiction of the decisions in New Thinking under Perestroika with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. And so it's much easier then to see why there would be some disagreement on the perceptions of the way that the institutional arrangements have unfolded since. There's one other element that I want to kind of bring out here too, and I know that this is going to be the theme of the paper with Stephen Blank, but nonetheless, in the context of the United States, we also should think about this, about perceptions of China. I do suspect that an awful lot of the posturing against the United States, which is seen as a worthy adversary, it's much less, you know, kind of I don't think plausible to have Georgia or Estonia as, you know, kind of one of your arch enemies that you're constantly manoeuvring about if you want to be a major global superpower, is that Russia is also thinking about future security challenges. When it builds up against the United States and refuses to kind of back down over a disagreement, it's also showing anybody else who might have any kind of aspirations or thoughts about Russia's territory or clashing with Russia on other issues, that Russia is a country to be reckoned with. and I think Richard has brought out that caution about China, but it's not just about the Russian Far East. It's actually the one element, Richard, that I thought you did miss a little bit here was in the Arctic. And if you talk to the Japanese, in the last couple of years, the Japanese actually saw an opening for rapprochement with China before, with Russia, before the rift in relations over Crimea, precisely because of what they saw, China's aspirations, not just in the Asia-Pacific, but also in the Arctic. As the Arctic ice melts, it becomes more the open seas. There's a lot of interest, obviously, in the Arctic becoming more of an international zone for transportation and for economic development, similar to the Antarctic. China's been building up a world-class icebreaker fleet, and not just again for the Antarctic. But there have been Chinese voyages of polar exploration into the Arctic. There's also been a lot of Chinese interest in buying up real estate in Iceland and Greenland, ostensibly for golf courses, but I don't think any of us really believe that that's a great place for golf, even if I come from Scotland, which has bad golf courses in terms of climate anyway. But they also made a bid for one of the tenders in Svalbard. And a couple of Chinese warships, after a naval maneuver with Russia, took the scenic route home around through the Sea of Okhotsk, through the Kuril Island Straits and around Japan a couple of years ago, and it sent the Russians into a flurry of activity and also behind the scenes dealings with their Japanese counterparts. So it seemed quite obvious that there was other things that they were very concerned about over the longer term. So I have to think that we also should factor in that not everything is always about us either, just as it might seem to be from the rhetoric. And that Russia has actually got some sensible strategic concerns over the longer term that it has to factor into.
Okay, thank you. When we met with Fiona first time with President Putin, it was like 12 years ago or something.
2004.
And I say yes, okay. And Fiona was, I remember Fiona was very pushy on Chechen question, trying to put Putin in a corner. I was astonished by one thing he said, and I think it's still very important to keep in mind. He, I believe, I don't know if you agree with me or not, does not think the United States is a democratic country. So you guys cannot be example for anybody, particularly for Russia. He said, look, we had a great Novgorod, Veliki Novgorod, where we had a вечер, who knows history, you know what I'm talking about, when everybody came to a central square and yelled, what do they want? And he said that was the Russian way to see democracy. Who has a stronger voice has more rights. In the United States, you have a quite opposite picture. Who has more money has more rights. And that's how he sees the United States. It's like, if you have money, you can protect yourself, you can do things in other countries, you can push other people. If you don't, you can get a decent lawyer and so on. That's not democracy. So why you guys talking about rule of law and justice and so on? And I think that's important to understand that despite all these historic differences and different narratives, he doesn't see, we don't see democracy the same way. What the democracy is here and there, and Putin quite convinced that Russia is a very democratic country in the Russian way, and the United States may be democratic, but in a very narrow meaning of American way of democracy. Using my position, I will, as a moderator, I will ask a first question. By the way, Fiona, I will add to your remark that Russia is Europe, Putin, Russia is a European country, Putin used to say. Not anymore. Last couple of years, you have probably noticed a difference in his sentence and in his definition. He said Russia is Europe. Russia is a real Europe. And Western Europe is getting more and more un-European, spoiled, with all this, influence from the East and, different, mostly liberal changes. And Russia is keeping real European values. So if you want to find Europe, and that's what message he's selling to Europeans. That's what he's saying to every European visitor in Moscow, and he's saying it all over again. If you want to find out what real Europe is and what it should be, look at Moscow, look at Russia. Anyway, my first question regarding to both of you, American foreign policy. I just came back from Russia and like 10 days or so ago, and I was astonished by practically feeling by everybody that United States can do nothing about Russia. What absolutely nothing. Sanctions, it's laughable. You know, I have my radio show on Radio Vesti FM, and last week we did a little poll among our listeners. Are sanctions good for Russia or bad? And we asked them, 86% said sanctions are good for Russia because it stimulates Russian economy and blah, 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 and only 14% said it's probably bad. But my question is, what United States can do, realistically speaking, and should do? I can give you, if you don't know yet, a recent Russian joke about it, and will illustrate my question. Imagine Putin is calling President Obama and saying, Barack, do you like it or not, we decided to take Alaska back. And Obama saying, well, Vlad, you can't do that, it's just against international law and so on. It's like, bad thing. And Putin said, we don't care because, you know, we checked the papers, it's very unclear, it's very gray papers, we don't know how you did get it, it's not really legitimate. So we take it back, I'm just calling you like a courtesy call to advance to tell you. And Obama saying, Vlad, you have to think about the price your country will pay. It will be a huge price. We can add another 10 people to the list of sanctions. So that's Russian attitude. What can you do? Another 10 people will be on the list of sanctions. And that's feeling Russia now is quite, it's probably the main political message in Russia. We have free hands, we can do whatever, Putin is great, he broke American dominance already. Now it's a question just to convince Europeans they can be much more free, open with, in confrontation with the United States. America is doing like evil things and will do all over the world. Now look at Macedonia, another color revolution there. We're trying, you know, because of pipes, gas pipe, you want to change the regime. So, but Russia basically mostly untouchable by the United States. Russian policy cannot be influenced by anything. It's strong enough. Is it so? Then what's the point? I mean, what America can do, should do, must do regarding Russia? Can you change your entire foreign policy toward Russia because of disagreement over Crimea, because of one foreign policy decision made by Putin, like for sure, he openly saying about this, but you know how they call Crimea in Russia, right? Crimea is a cream in Russia, so they call it ice cream. So Alaska is an ice cream for Russia. So next thing we'll take Alaska ice cream. Anyway, so that's my question. What the limits, possibilities, realistically speaking, for the United States to do something about Russian foreign policy?
Right, I think the problem is actually more difficult than you laid out because the U.S. view is similar in that we think we can accomplish most of the goals we want, at least the administration for the next 2 years, without having to worry about Russia. So you can work, you can manage China, or you can work on Iran and Iraq, and the Russians. There's not much they can do to block this, is their view. And then they, unlike with the first administration, where Russia was really the focus of much of their engagement after the reset. Now I think they're just trying to wait out. They're just going to wait and not going to do anything. I think Putin's also at the same approach. Is going to wait out the end of the Obama administration to see what comes next. In a way, you're right. We don't have strong tools because, as mentioned, there's not. Their economic and social ties. There's a limit anyway. So, and there's not much more damage each party can inflict on those. In terms of offering carrots, there's not much opportunity there either, since the kind of what Russia would benefit the Russian economy would be access to a lot of Western technology and Western managerial skills and so on, but those are either unavailable, remain unavailable, or are proven difficult to impose for the Russians, unlike, say, for example, the Chinese to absorb. But it's also a reflection of the fact that the differences are manageable. During the Cold War, you could envision scenarios where Russia or the United States and Soviet Union would go to war over Eastern Germany, trying to break free, or some other such scenario, an escalation from regional conflict. Now it's hard to envision where it interests this class seriously enough that they would actually, engage in direct conflict. So there's a limited benefit. There's limited few carrots, few sticks in the relationship, and I don't see that changing in the near term. Long term, Fiona might be onto something that mutual concerns about China may serve as a driver, as earlier mutual concerns about terrorism or mutual concerns about nuclear war drove cooperation. But for the next few years, I don't see any way the U.S. can really influence Russia or vice versa.
So basically, sorry for a second,
Yeah.
American strategy is to wait Russia to change its political system, Putin to go. That's like Cold War.
Right. I think the Obama administration has decided they can't get anything done with Russia for the next year and a half, so they're not going to try.
Putin definitely will run in 2018.
Right.
No questions about. Huh?
Right.
Probably then, yes. So if it's a goal to change the system, I don't see how it's achievable.
I don't think Richard was saying that, actually, Colby. I think what he was saying was actually just something much more straightforward, that the Obama administration has 2 more years, and why should they bother? Given the profile, and then we'll be in the fray, we will be anyway, very shortly, of the political campaign. I think the onus is actually on Moscow in that regard, thinking whether waiting out Obama, which of course they can wait out, is really that much of a sensible policy over the long term. And that really depends on, if Russia's assessment is as you said, then I presume they will just wait it out and then see what they get out of what's bound to be a race where every candidate in the primaries and then when it comes down to whoever the two are, Republican and Democrat, will be way right of Obama and much more hawkish on Russia and perhaps at least less restrained in their rhetoric. And then they'll have to see what they do when they get in office.
What to do? What
well,
could they do?
Because I think, look, and I actually, there's one thing where I do actually disagree with Richard right now. I actually can see scenarios where we end up in a miscalculation over Ukraine. Because again, if you get outside of the United States and you talk to people in the militaries, and including looking in our own military, nobody's quite sure what to make of the actions, the probing of the defences of NATO. Certainly if you're from the Baltic states, Poland, but not just, but also from up in Scandinavian countries, anywhere near the border, in the UK, where you're seeing overflights on a regular basis. And the Canadians and everybody else, and the militarisation and talk of militarisation in the Arctic, up against the frontiers there. Remember that's again another international frontier. There's the kind of thinking that people haven't had in 25 years. And although people might have dismissed the Allison and Symes article in the National Interest, there are a lot of people actually talking about the fact that there could be, some miscalculation that leads to a hostile act. And that's partly because in Russia, as well as this, bring it on, we don't care, what the heck, what can you do to us? There's been a lot of nuclear saber rattling, which seems to suggest that if a line is crossed, that the first recourse on Russia's part will be to use a tactical battlefield nuke. And that's a scenario that's been played out in a lot of military circles. And I think Putin thinks that there's a very high threshold based on, whatever assessments he's getting from his military through his, Genstab now on Frunzenskaya, for US or NATO action. I think that threshold might start to get a lot lower. And we can ask some of our colleagues again in Europe, where they might start to see a hostile act that could trigger an Article 5 defence response from a collision with a civilian aircraft, which has been narrowly averted a few times. The biggest reason that Europe slapped sanctions on Russia was because of the MH17 disaster. Putin was apparently insulted that we would accuse Russia of actually being responsible for this. But the insult was taken actually by the Europeans. Remember, it was mostly Europeans. It wasn't an American on that flight. It was mostly Europeans along with Malaysians and others who died, and just the whole way that was treated afterwards, and the joke that was made in Russian propaganda about that was deeply insulting to Germans, to Dutch, and to others who were the closest allies of Russia. That had a much bigger effect than you can possibly imagine on European thinking. So again, there is that sort of feeling on the Russian side that what can the United States do? There could easily be a miscalculation, and then, be back into some of the stand-ups that we almost had over the war in Georgia in 2008, where there were actually, on 2 occasions that I personally know of, some real risks of a military exchange between Russia and the United States that could have got out of hand. One in particular was when the US brought back the Georgian troops from fighting with the coalition in Iraq, and the Russians talked about shooting down the US plane. Now that could again be your, come on, what are you going to do, bravado, but that could easily have been, as one can imagine, if you play that out, a very dangerous moment where something could have gone wrong. And the main point is on the Europeans. Okay, the sanctions have not had any really major effect on the economy, but we have Sergei Alexashenko and a whole lot of other people in the audience here who know things about the economy. None of the Europeans in the business sector there are really talking about going back to business as usual, even if the sanctions are rolled back. There's an awful lot of investment that won't take place. I mean, we have Ed Verona here who used to run the US-Russia Business Council. You can't just make up business. You can't encourage people to go back if there's no commercial basis or if the risks are too high. Yes, the oil and gas companies will be on the next plane out. Of course they will be. But all kinds of other manufacturing companies and smaller investors who might have had a role in the Russian economy will think twice. Some big oil and gas companies like Eni of Italy, which were a really close partner of Russia, decide it's not worth it. And that they're going to move on to other holdings in Africa. So what the impact will be right now is harder to tell, but it won't be that people will go back to totally business as usual. And as I said, there's a much more hawkish view in circles in Europe than you might think about, precisely because they have their own conclusions about what's happening in Russia. So even if the United States goes into these scenarios that Richard has outlined, which actually 2 of them I think could easily be melded into one, limited partnership and conflict, indifference and regional retrenchment. I think we're already there in that. The United States can go on like this for quite a while. The question is really over the longer term whether it's really beneficial, as Richard has also pointed out in the report, for Russia to be stuck with China, or for any of us for that matter. I'm not saying that I think that this is a great scenario. In fact, I really do hope that we can find some way out of this. But I think over the longer term it will be very damaging for Russia and for all of us, that there will be, a reorientation, and that there really still is, right now, a very serious risk of miscalculation that we really have to deal with.
Well, so far, people in Moscow talking and giving me every time a long list of American miscalculations. Crimea, Ukraine, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, and so on. So they say, what the Putin's strongest point is? He just wait when American will make the next mistake. And will take advantage of that. He doesn't do anything, he doesn't initiate foreign policy. He just waits for opportunities. He's an opportunistic politician. He's a short distance runner. He doesn't run a marathon. He's a sprinter, political sprinter. He sees the corner, he runs to that, then he looks around, what the next corner is available, he runs to that corner, he takes a little piece here and there, and all what he took is because of American miscalculation. So that's how they see it. Again, it's a different narrative, but that's a realistic, view. That's a realistic description I'm giving you. What in Kremlin, how they see American foreign policy. It's a triumph from mistake to mistake. Anyway, let's open. Oh wow. Okay, Sergey, you were mentioned today already so many times. We have to start with you.
Sergey Alexashenko. I have 2 questions. Fiona, first to you. Cyber attack. For example, on Estonia, is it a breach of Article 5 or not? Because Russian hackers, they are very active in the recent times, and not only Estonia, but maybe even the United States. And second, if we are looking for the good future, if we are looking for relations beyond Ukraine, is it relations beyond Ukraine or beyond Ukraine plus Crimea? And if yes, if there is some potential for good relationship, what are common interests between Russia and the US could be in the future? Thanks.
Do you want to do some more? Or? Do you want to do the present?
If you feel comfortable, okay, guys, who's take over?
David Fishman, consultant. On Monday, Andy Cutchins hosted an Army War College presentation of war games about possible scenarios and so forth, which were comparatively mild and calm, given the backdrop of the last 3 to 6 months, let's say, and pretty much consistent with Richard's presentation today, and also Fiona, your comments on it. One of the questions there, though, was about the sequencing of the upcoming 2016 elections here and 2018 elections in Russia. And Fiona, you alluded to this. If Russia makes any of the miscalculations that you just laid out in terms of, aggression in the Baltics or further in Ukraine, so obviously, there's a strong consensus here in Europe what to do. We have an election coming up before Putin's election. Putin's election, and thinking he needs another win, he needs to do something else. Maybe, maybe not. The point is, we won't know that because our election comes first. How do you see, how do all three panelists for that matter, see that dynamic of the fact that we have an election coming up and the question about what to do with the status quo that both of you outline in a sense? This status quo isn't satisfactory to us. Forget about whether or not it's satisfactory to Russia. We don't have to deal with that until 2018 unless something funny happens in the end.
Okay, thank you. One more question from that side? Nobody? Okay.
Anton Fedyash, American University here in Washington.
By the way, if you heard about New Russian Culture Institute at American U,
That's me.
This is the guy, this is the director.
Milwaukee Institute. Quick question about the Obama administration disengaging or waiting out Russia. How do you explain Kerry's visit and Nuland's visit to Russia if the feeling is that nothing can be done and we're going to wait it out? Doesn't seem very likely to me. Thanks.
You want me to go first, Richard?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, on the Kerry and Newland visits, I think that really fits into some of the things that Richard again has laid out in this report, because it doesn't mean you're trying to fix the entire relationship. When you go on a visit, and I think we've learned from the past that when you do limit the contacts, it can be very dangerous, precisely because of these risks of miscalculation. Think back to the Bush administration in 2008 after the war in Georgia. They cut off all the relations at the high level. I mean, there was still some behind-the-scenes contacts. But after August of 2008, there were no high-level visits until Condoleezza Rice met with Lavrov in the margins of, I can't remember which meeting it was, sometime in September. It's actually some of our colleagues from the State Department might remember this. But there wasn't any high-level visits again or meetings until the Obama administration came along. And in the meantime, this kind of gets into some of the sequencing. We had, of course, it was all the midst of the election campaign. Remember John McCain, we were all Georgians at the time. There was a war during the election campaign that brought in the Obama administration. And part of the reset that the Obama administration initiated was to try to find ways of dealing with some of the issues you've got to deal with no matter what happens. You can't avoid having face-to-face meetings, you need to have channels. And so I see the Kerry Newland visits, and I'm not entirely sure exactly, but I think Tori Newland was much clearer that she was talking about Ukraine. From what I hear, Kerry's visit the impetus might have been about Syria, this worries about what's happening with Assad, some of the reversals on the ground and the chemical weapons that now still seem to be used, and clearly the United States and Syria, United States and Russia have a shared interest in Syria in getting rid of the chemical weapons, so I mean, that's an obvious one. There are issues that, as we've all said here, that are unavoidable that you have to basically deal with Russia, but they're unavoidable for Russia too to deal with the United States. And I don't believe for a second that Kerry would have gone to Russia without there being some signal behind the scenes. The picture I saw had Ambassador Teft standing there. Ambassador Teft has been very quietly the interlocutor behind the scenes with the Kremlin. He's been going in, we just haven't been hearing about it because he's not on Twitter and he's not out there in the public domain. He's doing what diplomats do, which is very quietly look for signals and do the working level contacts. He was obviously there during the whole Victory Day. He's obviously been working behind the scenes, and I've heard for some time that there was some visit planned. The fact that it happened then suggests that there was some particular trigger for it. There are lots of crises that have to be dealt with, and not having those channels of communication is very dangerous. And the Bush administration knew that just as much as the Obama administration does that. I mean, it's Kerry Newland. It's not the president. There's no sign of a kind of a summit coming up. I don't believe that this is some kind of a big diplomatic shift. It's addressing the reality that when there are problems, you have to deal with the people. You can't just do it through intermediaries. And Lavrov and Kerry, we have no evidence that Lavrov meets with Putin on a regular basis. So sometimes you've got to go there and have a face-to-face meeting. So I think that's kind of, people might disagree, but that might be one explanation. And I think, though, that's kind of part of the problem that we have, David, when we think about the sequencing. You know, the Kremlin and Putin are making it deliberately difficult for us to even guess the intentions. That's precisely the point. We're not supposed to. That makes diplomacy really difficult. And that's why I think you can get into a miscalculation. I mean, this is like World War I all over again. I mean, you think that there's no kind of, this is the environment for secret diplomacy. We're all very transparent. We're all here talking about all of this. But when you have complete lack of trust, when you don't have face-to-face meetings with people you trust, and when there's just a kind of an enormous amount of noise out there, you do run the risks of problems, and the electoral campaigns will be ample fodder for that. Mitt Romney, Russia's our #1 geopolitical foe, McCain, we're all Georgians, all of these kind of rhetoric will come out. We'll still need to have some channel behind the scenes to try to kind of make sure that there's no, you know, kind of miscalculation based on all of these various messages. Because this actually, Sergei, gets into your point about the common interests. Of course, we're common interests, and the interests are not just there because we need Russia more than, you know, Russia needs us and Iran. Russia wants to be in on the game on Iran. Iran is an important interlocutor for Russia. Russia doesn't want to see, you know, proliferation or Iran getting a nuclear weapon. They don't think they can do that much about it, but, you know, they want to be in on this action. It would be terrible to be the other nuclear superpower and not be in on the biggest negotiation about non-proliferation. Same with what happens in Korea, although I think North Korea, but I think Russia's going to be less likely in that game, not because of the United States, but because of China and other, you know, regional interests. And same on Syria. I mean, we know for a fact that Putin and Russia have serious equities on Syria. And to be not in those negotiations would be a real failing for Russian foreign policy. So that's where there are mutual real interests. It doesn't, however, suffice to change the overall relationship, just as the economy and economic and business ties haven't. And this issue about the cyber attack, I think, is, again, one of those key topics. I mean, right now, we haven't determined that it is. The only time that Article 5 has been triggered was over 9/11, and then you know, basically facilitating the coalition in Afghanistan. Richard actually spends his whole time thinking about this, so I think he might have more to say about it. But certainly the debate inside of Europe and inside of NATO is whether there should be a different threshold for Article 5, given all of this probing. And that's exactly why I talk about the miscalculation. Something that shouldn't have looked like a trigger for Article 5 might be construed as one as people start to talk more and more about the way that, you know, Russia could be destabilizing the adjacent neighbouring countries, especially the Baltic states, perhaps using, you know, the sort of staging of some civil unrest. I mean, that's an ongoing debate inside of NATO right now. So the threshold could be lowered. And that's something, again, where I think that Russia should take that a little bit more seriously when they're trying to make the posturing as, you know, obscure and as hard to penetrate as possible. But Richard, I mean, you've been thinking about this Article 5 of security issues. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's the same problem we're having now with China and land reclamation. You know, as long as the act is seen as marginal and gradual, it's just hard to get up to be able to justify a military response. And anything short of that doesn't really doesn't give them a strong incentive to stop. I think one of the reasons why I think we saw the Kerry visit was, as you mentioned, there's a concern that I mean, there's some issues we just want to get a better sense of what Russia's up to and perhaps have some say in. Particularly, you know, Ukraine, the Russians have pointed out, well, that maybe the U.S. isn't, at least the Russian press claims the U.S. isn't that interested because it's not participating in the Normandy format and so on. And the Europeans are ignoring the U.S. advice on the arms sales and so on. I imagine they also talked to wanted to register their concerns about the S-300 after, you know, Obama made a comment that was interpreted as a green light for that sale. They probably wanted to explain that's not the U.S. view, and I mean they're probably discussing Iraq and so on. The only I mean they don't think we have any in what was the main points that he said. The only thing that might differ is in the elections. I'm not in the Russia side. It's clear to me that the dynamics as Nikolai laid out are such that, you know, Putin's very popular now. When he stands up to the U.S., they can blame the sanctions as further problems and convince people they can ignore them. And as President Obama himself has said, you know, the problem with the sanctions is they're not going to have an effect until it starts costing Putin politically, and so far it hasn't done that. In the U.S. side, I think it's less clear to me how this is going to play. You've got certainly a number of people making now some hardline statements about Russia, but not all. You know, on the Republican side, there's some who seem just don't consider this issue all that important. I imagine if you do get, once you get the new leadership in top, there's going to be a tension between wanting to take hardline position on Russia and not, and dealing with some of the other problems that are concerned